Just tied directly to militia.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court simply interpreted that as to not be the case anymore. And they decided that everyone should be able to bear arms, whether you're with a militia. Now, if you look at the history of militias, local militias, which everyone remembers, the Minutemen and all that stuff that were the militia, they were evolved through legislative processes into what is today the modern National Guard. So when we say militia today, that equivalent is National Guard. Now, you can make a case that says only the National Guard, who are citizen soldiers, should have the right to bear arms, and it would make sense. But the court didn't interpret it that way, and the court says everyone should have the ability to bear arms.
Right.
We're seeing this now, and one of the things that we're seeing now is that the decisions that are being made along partisan lines. And the entire concept of the Supreme Court is that they're supposed to be impartial. They're appointed. They're not elected.
Mm-hmm.
And they could be appointed by either party, of which parties themselves technically are unconstitutional, since there's no concept of political parties in the Constitution that you can make an argument for right there. But the problem that we're running into now is you've got people that are on the court that are not necessarily making impartial decisions from what people are saying. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of tough to watch, honestly. Especially when you think about how you would like things to work we're not necessarily a straight up democracy. We're a republic, or a democratic republic, right?
Federal republic.
Yeah. But in a certain extent, you would want the will of the people to be reflected by the people that are leading us. And I don't really think that's the case necessarily, especially when we are going to look at a lot of these rulings today. A lot of people don't agree with these rulings, but there really is nothing we can do about it because they're the Supreme Court and they hold all the power when it comes to these things. And especially when you've got the conservative majority, obviously a conservative agenda is going to be more pushed, than the other side of things. And there's just no getting around that.
Well, and the one point the article makes is that the only thing that Congress can do to take back the power that the people elected into them would be to come up with amendments to the Constitution. So the Supreme Court would then have to consider these amendments. Of course, they could rule any way they wanted on those amendments. But the problem you run into now is that the political environment is so contested, there's no way you're going to get both Republicans and Democrats to agree enough to get any kind of amendment passed. And to be honest with you, with the politicians we have today, I think the last thing this country needs is people starting to write amendments to the Constitution.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope.
So how do we get that power back into the hands of the people?
Oh, you're asking me? I have no idea. I mean, like we talked about, these folks aren't elected; they're appointed. So I guess it would be voting for the political candidates that you think would appoint the judges you want. But even then, there's no guarantee that's going to happen. I don't know if there's a legal way to to contest it. I don't think there is, right? It's the Supreme Court. I mean, you always go to that higher power. The highest power for law is the Supreme Court, right? So maybe at the state level.
Theoretically, the only thing that really could be done would be what the Republicans were concerned the Biden administration was going to do, and that is pack the courts. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing constitutionally that says the court is limited to 9 justices. We've had more in the past. So the president could call for the expansion of the Supreme Court, add, say, 3 additional people to the Supreme Court, appoint 3 Democrats, so you'd have
6 and 6.
6 and 6 at that point in time, and try to bring some balance back to it. That's feasible, and that's something that's well within his power, but the punishment of the attacks that, I mean, if you look at history, whenever government power has been balanced, where the executive is one party and the legislature is another party,
nothing gets done.
Yeah. And really, that's really the best scenario that we have at this point in time is gridlock, because if neither side can get anything done, they can't screw things up any more than they already have.
Yep. Or further assert their own agenda and get more power for themselves.
That's it. And the problem that you have right now is that when you can appoint members to the Supreme Court that will carry out your agenda and not be impartial, that is packing the court, really.
Right.
And they did exactly that under Trump, where they rushed through the last appointment after Ginsburg died.
Yep.
And had she held out, and I don't mean to make light of this, but had she held out, because I think she was in a state of coma at the time, and they had just kept her on life support, they couldn't have filled that seat until after the election. And you would have had a more balanced, it still would have been imbalanced, but you would have had a more balanced court at that time. So
Yeah.
I think the problem we have is the process by which justices are appointed is now ripe with corruption, and it has become a political process. And I think that the integrity of the Supreme Court has deteriorated to the point that you've got Supreme Court justices now that are under investigation for corruption themselves, where you've got Clarence Thomas, who's under investigation for taking undeclared presents or undeclared gifts, basically bribes,
Right.
from a very prominent, very well-known Republican supporter that he was supposed to declare and didn't. And when you've got that kind of suspicion on your Supreme Court, it's really hard to take them seriously as being a Supreme Court at that point.
Yeah, because ideally, at the end of the day, we all know politicians are corrupt, right? I mean, everybody knows that. But ideally, you would want the last line of defense to be the Supreme Court, to be impartial, to be the one thing you can count on to kind of right the ship. But that is not the case anymore, and maybe it hasn't been for a while.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that's the problem we're at. That's the situation we're in now, where they were always the sanity check. They were always the ones that came in impartially. Not always. I mean, there was partiality in there for years, but they were the element of government that would come in that were the babysitters, that would, push the two sides apart and say, all right, let's look at this. Let's look at what's legally precedent. Let's look at what's best for the country, and let's do the right thing. And you're just not getting that referee from them now.
Yep.
So I think we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at some of the more impactful decisions from the most recent term of the court. We'll be right back. For over 7 years, the Second Sith Empire has been the premier community guild in the online game Star Wars: The Old Republic. With hundreds of friendly and helpful active members, a weekly schedule of nightly events, annual guild meet and greets, and an active community both on the web and on Discord. The Second Sith Empire is more than your typical gaming group. We're family. Join us on the Starforge server for nightly events such as operations, flashpoints, world boss hunts, Star Wars trivia, guild lottery, and much more. Visit us on the web today at www.thesecondsithempire.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to Insights into Tomorrow. Today we are discussing the Supreme Court and some of their recent decisions. So the first thing we're going to cover is the ruling on affirmative action. The Supreme Court effectively gutted affirmative action, ending race-conscious admissions. In a historic decision, the U.S. Supreme Court recently, like we just said, ended race-conscious admission programs in colleges and universities across the country. In a decision divided along ideological lines, the 6 conservative justices, supermajority, that's a cool word, maybe not in practice, but it's a cool word, invalidated admission programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. The decision reverses decades of precedent upheld over the years by narrow Supreme Court majorities that included Republican-appointed justices. It also ends the ability of colleges and universities, public and private, to do what most say they still need to do, and that's consider race as one of the many factors in deciding which of the qualified applicants is to be admitted. So that's the first thing we're covering. This is a pretty big deal, especially for those that are affected by it. And it was really that public and private thing that I really latched onto, that it's everywhere. You think of the big schools, like it mentions Harvard and North Carolina, but this is going to affect a lot more than just them.
Yeah, and there's, with all things, there's two sides to every story here. And really what we're looking at here is you've got one side that basically says that you can't, by bringing race in and giving preferential treatment to one race over another is discrimination. So you can't do that. When the point of doing that was because discrimination existed already.
Right.
And you were getting preferential treatment to one race over another. So they legislatively forced you to, if not change that practice, then to at least adhere to certain percentages, certain quotas that you had to have. And the problem that you run into here is that you're saying, okay, let's do it away with discrimination administratively. Well, then in a perfect world, that works. You can do that. But we don't live in a perfect world, because when you do away with administrative discrimination, you still have endemic
societal
yeah. discrimination that's going to take over in that place.
And that's kind of the thing, that when people argue that, they argue the first point that you said of, oh, well, it's discriminatory to have affirmative action. But then people forget that racism exists, and
Right.
that's why it had to be forced in the first place, is because if we make it laissez-faire, it doesn't work. It's not equal, and it needs to be mandated to make it. Well, I guess it's not equal, but you know what I mean. To give those people the opportunity that they otherwise probably would not be afforded, and now will not be afforded.
Well, and I think that was what the original point of this legislation was. It was to force you to make it even. But in trying to get to that point, you simply instituted a different form of discrimination. So you're treating the symptom, not the problem. Mm-hmm. The problem really is the discrimination. And until human beings can evolve to the point that they don't discriminate, you're not gonna have that happy balance. And that's kind of what the majority have argued. The 6-3 majority, conservative majority in the court, argued, quote, many universities have for too long concluded, wrongly, that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges bested, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. Now, I take exception to that one to begin with there, because our Constitution declares that all men are created equal. And when it was written, they knew all men weren't created equal, because also in the Constitution, 3/5, every African American who was in the country was counted as 3/5 of a person. So the hypocrisy in the Constitution itself tells me that we don't have a constitutional history that says this is intolerant.
Yeah.
As he has done before, Justice Thomas, the second black justice appointed to the court, reiterated his long-held view that affirmative action imposes a stigma on minorities. Now, this I think he has a point with. I don't think the way he puts it here has a point. He says, quote, while I'm painfully aware of the social and economic ravages which have befallen my race and all who suffer discrimination, I hold our enduring hope that this country will live up to its principles that all men are created equal, all equal citizens, and all must be treated equally before the law. Now, I think he's smart enough to know that that's not how the world is right now.
No, that's
The fact that he makes a statement like this is naive, and it's insulting, really, that he would make this
it puts
statement.
the ball in our court of hey, man, we got rid of it. You guys got to be better.
Right.
It's no, the Supreme Court exists to do that. It is your job, and more so part than every citizen, to uphold these values and to fight for this kind of equality that you're talking about here, but you're not doing that. You're doing the opposite of that. And then
Right.
you're basically washing your hands of it and saying, well, hey, we live in a society, you know what I mean? Like,
Right. Now, to Thomas's point, I can understand the rationale that by holding African Americans to a lower standard, that you're imposing a stigma on them. And really, if it was me, I would be insulted. So really what we're talking about here is if you have two people who are one white, one black, they both apply for school, you have to take, under normal circumstances, you would take the person who's the most qualified, and that qualification would be equally measured. But instead, what we're talking about here is somebody who may need a 3.5 grade point average if they were Caucasian to get in, an African American may only need a 3.25. And Thomas's point is, by holding them to that lower standard, you're basically telling them that they're not good enough. So there's a logic to it, but the way that he uses that logic is so distorted and so tone deaf to the spirit of this legislation, because what's happening is, in reality, you're saying, reality is saying, if the Caucasian has a 3.5 and the African American has a 3.5, we're going to let the Caucasian guy in because he's not black. And that's what reality is.
yeah.
And Thomas fails to address that with his stigma argument. So Chief Justice Roberts goes on, and for his part, pointed out the court's 2003 decision reaffirming the constitutionality of affirmative action programs, noting that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the court at the time, had suggested that there would have to be an end at some point in the future. And Roberts declares that time is now. And I think the problem is, it hasn't. Human beings,
It's only gotten worse.
not even human beings, Americans have not gotten to the point